Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday, and thanks so much for joining us for this webinar, which I'm really excited about, which is a presentation from Together Yes about how allies can support us achieving a successful yes vote in the referendum to have a First Nations voice enshrined in the Australian Constitution. I'm on Turrbal and Yagara land here in Brisbane, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also encourage you to acknowledge the lands you might be meeting us on from in the chat this morning. QCOSS is really excited to be involved as an ally, supporting the campaign for a yes vote in the referendum coming up later this year. We are a member of the Allies for Uluru Coalition, which is a coalition of over 200 community organisations who are coming together to support the Yes campaigns, as well as First Nations campaigners, both in reference to or in relation to the referendum, but also to achieve full implementation of the generous gift that is the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So including a voice, a truth-telling process or makarata, and also a treaty. We're really excited this morning to have Mary Crooks join us. Mary developed this advocacy tool that we're going to learn about today, which is based on the what some would call simple concept that when people come together around a kitchen table and have honest conversations with friends and families, minds can be changed. And it is a really effective technique that's been used in many campaigns to achieve successful outcomes. Usually the sessions are run by Mary Crooks, who's with us today from the Victorian Women's Trust, and also Leanne Miller, who is the Executive Director of Koori Women Mean Business. Unfortunately, Leanne's not with us today, but Mary is, and we're really pleased to have her. Mary's been and Leanne have both been travelling extensively around Australia to help people to develop the capacity to have these conversations with their friends and people in their network to help ensure that we do have a successful yes vote in the referendum later this year. It's incredibly exciting to have Mary with us. She is, after an extensive public policy career, as I said, she's the Executive Director of the Victorian Women's Trust. She designed and has implemented her advocacy strategy in connection with many campaigns, including the Purple Sage Project and our Watermark Australia. This method that we're going to be learning about today was most famously employed by Voices for Indi during the campaign for Cathy McGowan's successful election in 2013. It's really fabulous to have you with us, Mary. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I hand over to Mary, I'll just do some housekeeping. So we are in Zoom. We are recording the session so that we can continue to use it after this morning. And we are going to be taking questions from you this morning, and hopefully after Mary's presentation, we'll have some time to do a bit of a question and answer session. So if you put your questions in the chat, I'll be monitoring those, and after Mary's presentation, I'll see what I can do in terms of how many of those questions I can put to Mary. So enough from me, I think. I'll pass over to you. Thank you, Mary.
Amy, thank you. And thank you and Elspeth for creating the opportunity for me to Zoom in with a lot of your constituents. So what I'd like to do, the best way of capturing Together Yes as a campaign tool for the Yes campaign is by a slide deck. It means that we just don't have to go on and on and on about it, and we capture the essence of it. And I think it's a really good way for us to cut to the chase. So I'll use the slide deck presentation, and then if we can, as you say, take questions. So I think it's very important that I say at the outset, though, that when we've been holding these sessions around the country, we're making it clear that we're not holding them to debate the pros and cons of the referendum. We're actually doing this to bring the referendum home. So I just don't want people who are listening and watching this to be saying, but when are we going to talk about the different issues of the referendum? Because this is not the briefing to do that. So if I could have the next slide, thanks, Maria. So I too would like to acknowledge country, Amy. I live and work on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and I'm glad that you mentioned Leanne. Leanne Miller is a Yorta Yorta woman. She heads up Koori Women Mean Business, and it's important to tell you, I think, that for 31 years now, Koori Women Mean Business and the Victorian Women's Trust have been in close partnership with one another, standing shoulder to shoulder. Leanne would have you say that she, in all of her travels, has yet to find many comparable examples of a non-Indigenous women's organisation standing shoulder to shoulder with an Indigenous women's organisation. And in some respects, that deep relationship we've had for 3 decades was one of the principal motivations spinning us into wanting to do something in the campaign. And Leanne is a member of the First Nations Assembly in Victoria, which was our first attempt to create a voice and then move into truth-telling and treaty. So like you, Amy, and QCOSS, we have accepted that gracious invitation that is there in the majestic statement from the heart. And I think it's important to remind people that in that statement from the heart, the invitation to journey with Indigenous people to a better world is actually not aimed at politicians. It's an invitation extended to all of us, to ordinary folk around the country. So we come in under the Yes Alliance campaign team, and I just want to acknowledge straight out how fantastic it has been to come in under the umbrella of this Indigenous-led campaign and to be of service to the campaign. So if we can move on to the next slide. I'd really love people to just take a minute now. I'll stop talking and just take a minute and to read this extraordinary commentary from a Yolngu elder who passed about 5-6 weeks ago. So if you could just take a minute. So the important point we want to make here on the basis of this commentary is that we're not coming into the campaign in a neutral position. As I said, our unambiguous motive is to help bring home the yes vote. And while this stupid phone, sorry, while this wonderful invitation is there, the gift that we can receive from Aboriginal Australia, it's up to us to choose to accept it in a meaningful way. So this is our starting point that we move into the campaign with. We have to reckon with the past that we have thrown at people, the past dispossession and its cruel and sustained impacts. But we are on about journeying to a much better world for Aboriginal people and for all Australians. Next slide. In the Uluru Statement, many of you will have read it, and it does embody this wonderful concept of makarata, the coming together after a long struggle. And Professor Mark McKenna from Sydney Uni captures this. He says, if we understand the past, then we understand the argument for the voice. So that's also part of our starting position. Thank you. Next slide. So just quickly, in terms of the national campaign structure, we come in under the Australians for Indigenous Constitutional Recognition. This is the official governing body and fundraising body for the Yes Alliance. It was set up in February, co-chaired by the wonderful Rachel Perkins and Danny Gilbert. Dean Parkin was the CEO of From the Heart. He's now CEO of Yes 23. You can see the website there, yes23.com.au. Cara Keys and Paul Murphy are both the Deputy Campaign Directors. Emily Holm is the National Field Organiser, and we've been working most closely with Emily on a weekly basis since October last year. And I'm happy to say that only over the last 3-4 weeks that the Yes 23 people have been able to put at least two people in every state and territory, 2 people to assist the campaign effort. So it's Yes 23 and QCOSS. It's probably, if you haven't already met the Queensland people, then I'm sure that'll happen soon. So we come in under that campaign, and essentially in about July, August, September last year, we made overtures to bring our model into the service of the campaign, and I'm grateful and privileged that the Yes campaign have embraced us ever since. It's just been a wonderful partnership. Thank you. Next slide. So these campaign principles are really important for people to understand, to be aware of, because everybody who's come in under the Yes campaign has pledged that we will practice these principles. They were first articulated in Brisbane in October last year in a collaboration laboratory, and they were refined, checked off, and they were part of the launch in Adelaide in February. So be in solidarity. We will not compete with one another. We will not let egos get in the way. We will be there to support one another with knowledge, resources, and just even personal support at times. But we will not compete. We will complement. We will complement campaign effort. We will seek to integrate where we can. We will honour culture. Clearly, for example, we will take advice and instruction and the wisdom of the Indigenous-led campaigners we're working with, but we'll also honour culture in other important ways. And one of the most exciting examples I can quickly mention, which I think is going to be launched just this week, is where Jewish communities across the country have joined forces with us, and they have sought our permission to morph our Together Yes website into their own website, a new website which is called Shabbat Table Talks. So they want to join us in conducting these kitchen table conversations all around the nation later this year, but they want to do so understandably within their own cultural fabric, their Shabbat Friday night dinners with one another. So we've completely joined forces with Ilona Lee in Sydney, who's masterminded this, and that wonderful initiative is likely to be launched later this week. But it's one of many, many interlocking community initiatives that have been occurring over the last few weeks, which is all part of the movement, the civic movement that needs to be built across the country to bring the referendum home. We will connect with communities and not tell communities how to do things. I've jumped one. We will contest ideas, not people. This is very important. The debate is already a bit nasty, and it may get nastier, but we will be in there making sure that we contest ideas vigorously, but we will not be contesting or personalising or attacking people. And most of all, we will try and ensure safety in our own method and where we can, looking out for one another. And I know Yes 23 is very aware and mindful of a more recent experience, for instance, with the same-sex marriage proposition, that caused a lot of harm. The nature of the debate by those in opposition caused a lot of harm some years ago, and people are going to be on a lookout to make sure that that's mitigated where possible during this campaign. Thank you, Maria. Next slide. So in essence, Together Yes, we want it to be nationwide and a unifying movement. We want it to bring people together in strong and clear and respectful dialogue with one another, not pitting people against one another. It was, as Amy said, created by us at the Victorian Women's Trust over 20 years ago. We've applied the model many times in many different locales and different circumstances. So it's not only been tried and tested, but the good news is that it actually works. The good news is that when we did negotiate from the heart last year about coming into the campaign, we knew that we had a model that could be refined and tailored and adapted, but it was not untried. So if we can move on to the next slide, which speaks to the origins, and I'm not going to go into each of these. The reason we focus a little bit on this, though, is to give you the confidence that Together Yes is a reliable method and not something that is a bit off the scale. We did apply it first in Victoria in the Kennett era. We had some 6,000 women and men involved, and it was a powerful first time ever type community engagement process. And it had tremendous implications, to be honest. It led us to then say, well, if we were doing this kind of process again, let's do it next time on a single issue, and an issue that was really complex, because we felt that the method could handle complexity. And that's why we chose back then to focus on water. And interestingly, even back then, we had people saying, why is the Women's Trust doing a project on water? Which is sort of interesting in terms of water reform and water management and water policy had pretty much been a male preserve. But that was the first time, our watermark, where we grappled with the idea of producing session materials that would make a difference in helping people recalibrate their thinking. And I'll come to that later. But that's the first time we grappled with the underlying small e educational process, if you like, that sits within this kitchen table model. It's not simply about people coming together and having a chat. It's actually about people coming together, working through and processing some quite substantial material and arriving at a different place than from the beginning of the discussion. Our watermark was so successful, it was picked up by the CSIRO to use for their Energy Mark program. And as Amy said, it was actually the federal seat of Indi that is probably the most famous deployment. And in short, in 2012, Cathy McGowan and Alana Johnson came to me. They had just formed Voices for Indi 3 months before, and they said, can your model be adapted to an electorate? And I pretty much listened and I said, yes, it can. And then they said, well, if that's the case, will you help? And I said, yes, I will. And so I spent 6 months training up and mentoring Voices into rolling out their engagement process over Indi. And in the end, the rest, as they say, is history, in that Cathy became the first independent in over 100 years to win that seat, shaved a 9% swing off to do so, defied the national trend, and won it because of the engagement process and their very, very smart 3-month campaign, and the fact that Cathy was probably one of the most credentialed candidates ever to put a hat in the ring anyhow. But this is not to say that the kitchen table model suits independent candidates. It's just that independent candidates like Cathy and the Teal candidates that were largely instrumental in government changing last May, they understand the need to have a different paradigm at work in defining the relationship between constituents and their MPs. And that's largely about listening and respecting and taking your constituents into your confidence and you being grounded in the wisdom that they live their lives by. And so various other iterations have occurred over the years. And I think it is no surprise to you that when Albanese announced the referendum in the first term of their government in May last year, that we ached to try and bring our model into the service of the Yes campaign. So that's why we're here. So if we can move on now to talk a little bit more, and Amy flagged this early in her introductory comments. I know from experience, lots of experience, and others who have been in the educational arena know this, that when people are engaged in safe and respectful dialogue, able to respond to thoughtful material and to be responding in a way that digs into their own experience and wisdom, then the outcomes can be truly transformative. So our whole aim is to enable people to have meaningful conversations over the next few weeks and months that truly inspire yourself and your neighbours and your friends and colleagues to think most critically about what we think is the most defining issue of our lifetime, to just do a little bit of work on our heads and our hearts and our minds to get ready to vote later in the year. Next, please, Maria. So this is how it works. Small groups come together in the comfort either of their homes or a communal space, or, it could be a cafe, could be a library, committee room, community room in a library, but somewhere in people's own patches. And there will be 2 sessions. They'll run for maybe 1.5 hours each. Probably by the time people mingle and have a cuppa and say their goodbyes, it might end up being 2 hours or so. And each of the 2 sessions will be scheduled to occur mainly within 3 or 4 weeks after the first one. And the reason for that is that the kind of thinking that's gone on during session 1, we want people to have the chance to ruminate. We want people to have the chance to just reflect a bit on what was covered. And importantly, we will be providing a little bit of a menu in that interim period, 6 to 8 or so little gems of materials that can be read or listened to that actually help shore up the learnings that have occurred in session 1. So the entire conversation period is from, say, late May to late August. So in other words, once people sign up to be hosts, they can have their conversation. It might occur, sometime in June, and 3 or 4 weeks later, another conversation. The main thing is that most of the nationwide deliberative conversations in these groups take place until the end of August. And the reason we've chosen May to launch the whole process of conversation is because of those 2 significant milestones in our nation's identity formation. The 56th anniversary of the 67 referendum and the 6th anniversary of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, both of them occurring in May. So we love the psychological power of lining up these kitchen table conversations in the month of May. And the important thing is that we supply you with these highly curated materials. So if we move on, the key to the whole process is people like yourselves stepping up and saying, you know what, I reckon I'm a yes voter right now, but I'm prepared to do something other than just walk into the ballot box. And I'm prepared to be a conversation host. I will use my agency to bring 6, 7, 8, 9 people together. We will, in turn, provide the practical advice, the support, and the quality materials. So you don't have to be constructing the discussion yourself. You actually become, in a way, the born organiser and the born facilitator and the born chair of a meeting. And the materials do all the rest for you. Thanks, Maria. So it's very important that you don't feel as though, I can't do this, I don't know enough. I don't know enough about the referendum. I don't know enough about the Constitution. You don't need to know anything technically about the Constitution, or even for that matter, much about the referendum, except to know what the fundamental issues are that you'll be voting on. You need to be able to download the materials from our website, read them through carefully, and basically work your way through what we hope will be a very well-paced discussion. And that's it. So 2 groups to organise and manage, each taking 1.5 to 2 hours. We reckon it's about 8 hours of your citizen time. Now, I reckon if the referendum, as I'm punting, will be October the 14th, don't hold the government to that, but that's when I think it will be. You can hold me to it if I get it wrong. But how good would it be if all of us at the end of October were able to look back and say, you know what, I started off wanting to vote yes for this, and then I decided to get it home I needed to take one more step as a citizen, and I did that, and the results were great, and that 8 hours of my citizen time worked out to about 14 minutes a week. So that's the ask. Thanks, Maria. I don't know if this sound is going to work. So Maria and Elspeth, I think what we'll do is stop the film. We'll stop the film, and everybody who's in attendance today can actually go to the website and watch that film. It's on the homepage. But there are some of our early conversation hosts telling you why they've signed up. So let's move on to the kind of learning power. I've already indicated that I think when you get people together, important changes in thinking and perspective happen. And I just urge you to reflect over the next few days, to reflect on your own personal and professional existence, and put aside the fact of, you're not everyone's signed up doing courses, not everyone's in book groups. People might be reading newspapers online or hard copy. People might be on social media. You might be watching television news. You might be listening to radio. But really, at the end of the day, I reckon that most of the development and change in our thinking comes by knocking around with people, listening to people, conversations with people, talking footy with your mate at the footy ground, going to the footy and talking with somebody who actually knows more about the game than you do, but isn't arrogant about it and shares their insight and whatever. And you come away with a slightly different knowledge of what you had before. And I reckon if you do a bit of an audit on how we all tend to calibrate, recalibrate, reframe, grow our perspectives, it's largely through the wisdom and the connection we have with other people, rather than learning our way through books all the time. So that's the ethos. So in our discussion materials, and there's a leap of faith involved here, and we're just fine-tuning the session 1 materials, but we're trying to develop materials that don't exist in the campaign anywhere else, which if you lock into them, you actually find that they're encouraging and enabling you to form a sense of identification and connection to the underlying issues that will make it a lot easier for you to understand why a yes vote is the way to go. So, for example, in the first session, there will be a very simple exercise right at the beginning to have you understand that the 200 or so years of European invasion and occupancy, in the scale of things, is a blink in a moment of time when you connect with what 65,000 years of occupancy of this huge continent has been, and how it has been stewarded over millennia. A simple exercise, a profound exercise that I think will have people sort of get that if we do connect properly with the fact that this is the oldest continuous culture on Earth, then when you're asked the question, Do we want to honour and respect that occupancy by recognising first occupants of this country? The answer is pretty much a no-brainer. So that's the kind of thing we're doing in the sessions, to provide material that doesn't exist in the campaign generally, but enables people to just start locking into some really important underpinning concepts. The first session, I can flag, the first session will be themed around recognising, and the second session will be around what is the voice and how will it make a material difference. So each session is connected one to the other. Thanks, Maria. So the power of the movement, and understand that this kitchen table model, this will be the first time in our social and political history that we'll be able to look back and see that hundreds of thousands of people were able to have conversations because of the direct participation of people. We're doing something that's never been done on a national scale before. So I've talked about the power of one person, the person who puts the hand up to say, yep, I'll have a crack at this. That person brings up to 10 others into the direct participation. After 2 sessions, which we hope will be pleasant, secure, inspiring, and well worth it through the quality of the discussion and the recalibration that's gone on in people's thinking, we'll be asking people, now that you're feeling that bit more self-assured and confident, how about you have at least 10 individual conversations up until polling day? How about you try conversing about these key concepts, why you're voting yes with confidence, to your mates, to your recalcitrant uncle, to the 19-year-old in your family who couldn't be bothered coming into the group but has a vote, to your retailers, to fellow parents in the schoolyard, to your workmates. Not nasty conversations, conversations in good faith, but conversations where even if someone doesn't want to talk to you about it, you have the confidence to say, well, I'm voting yes because of this, and you can articulate some real depth and clarity to your argument, then that is likely to actually impact on a swinging voter more than you might realise. So if you had the modest figure of 1,000 hosts, bringing 10,000 people into direct participation, and if all of those have the confidence and the excitement of then carrying individual conversations, at least 10 of those, then that's 100,000 people. That's a modest target, and we are well in excess of that now, thankfully. And by the time June arrives, we will have many thousands of conversation hosts, bringing many hundreds of thousands of people into the conversation. Thanks, Maria. Now, this is the most important slide in the whole deck, I might say, because we had feedback from earlier this year from lots of people actually saying, but I don't need, people saying, oh, congratulations, Together Yes sounds great, but I don't need to be signing up because I'm already voting yes, and so are all my mates. And this slide says, well, that's all very well, sunshine, but it's not going to bring the referendum home. That's the actuality of it. This is why. Because the polling since early in the year, and is not changing much yet, is that the hard yes, which would be myself and hopefully many of you, is only in a slight majority. It's in the 50s, but not even in the high 50s. And at the moment, it's in the early 50s across all states and territories. But I remind you that when the same-sex marriage proposition were put in that dreadful postal survey, that the community support for that proposition dropped significantly during the course of a very nasty campaign. And we can't afford, if we want to bring it home, we can't afford to see the hard yes vote drop to 49%. We have to actually see it either stay in the 50s and gradually accrete over the next few months. Then there's a soft yes group. Now they're a sizable minority, And they're the people who are inclined to vote yes, but they're likely to tell you, I'm confused, we need more detail, and so on. Then there's a soft no, again, a sizable minority, and they're sort of saying at the moment, look, I'm not very inclined, but who knows? I mean, maybe if I see some better arguments put, I might change my mind. And then there's the hard no. Now, the hard no are not for changing, frankly. And I've got into a bit of trouble in a few sessions where people thought that I was being mean and beating up the hard no's by being so adamant about it. What I mean is that for us at Together Yes, with our limited time and limited resources and limited effort, we can't afford to invest that limited time and effort where people are simply not interested in changing. It would just be a waste of our time. So we're concentrating our efforts strategically on trying to provide a basis by which people who are soft yes and maybe soft no, for all the right reason and logic and rationality, actually come to a clearer position in the lead up to the poll and join the yes vote. That's our strategic aim. But if people sign up now to join this campaign as hard yes, then imagine after running 2 sessions, the kind of clarity and confidence you would have to be able to take the case to people in the run up to the election. So if you're in the hard yes camp now, then I think that with one step, you can actually do something really important. And even if you positively influenced 5 to 15 people by your clarity and position, then that's going to make a real difference. Thanks, Maria. So our website is our principal communication between conversation hosts. Frequently asked questions. There's 5 actually essays already up there on constitutional indifference, taking the children away, government control in the protection era, massacres, and what I might say is the extraordinary process leading to the Uluru Statement. So once people step up to be conversation hosts, they get a password protected access to the portal, which is theirs, campaign updates, thinking pieces, and importantly, where the materials will be downloadable by late May. That says mid-May, I can tell you now. We're just running a bit behind time and they'll be released late May. So I'd really encourage you to look at the website and there's a lot of learning to be had even by visiting that website, let alone using it as the communication tool with us. Next, thanks, Maria. Marcia Langton has put it so beautifully when she says, we have a duty, if we want to accord First Peoples a rightful, honourable place in the nation's fabric, in our birth certificate as a modern Australia, the Constitution, then we should be voting to have First Nations people on the constitutional birth certificate. And the only way we'll get there, in her view, is by talking. Not simply by going to barbecues, not simply by putting core flutes on your fence, not simply by attending an inspirational town hall gathering, all fantastic initiatives, but talking, respectful, collegial talking, not yelling, not screaming, not biting someone's heads off. This is what will win it. Now, we can't afford to have it fail, in our view. I mean, I've wanted this sort of opportunity all my adult life as I've learnt my way through recreating, getting away from our settler narrative and becoming much more in touch with the historical truth of our nation. And I just think it would be an absolute unmitigated disaster for this country if we can't get up this very modest proposal. And part of the reason, as I've toured around the country, part of the reason I feel even more compelled to work on it is because there is a significant much more positive and empathetic generation coming up through kids, primary school kids, secondary, tertiary. And those generations, we owe it to them, I think, by giving them a halfway decent platform to continue the kind of genuine reconciliation work that they are much more capable of than my generation has been. But I think you also know that a referendum has to go through two obstacles. The first is there has to be a national majority. So across every state and territory, the majority of Australian voters need to vote yes. That's the first hoop. The second one is that the territories then drop out, ACT and Northern Territory. And the referendum requires a majority of states to carry a majority in their state. So that means if the vote is carried in 4 states, then the referendum wins. If Queensland is soft, Western Australia is soft, Victoria is soft, and 3 states only record majorities, the referendum is doomed. Now, I was in Tassie before Easter, and we're going back, and it was just a real thrill to be there because their community is taking this up, and they've declared that they want Tasmania to be the referendum superpower because they have, they have, as I say, a Liberal Premier who is pro-vote, pro-voice, an outgoing Premier pro-voice, and for all the right reasons. They love Bridget Archer. So they're working hard, and they've got less people to have to worry about. So in my view, actually, I reckon Tasmania might hold the key to bringing it home. So there's work to be done. It won't be enough. It won't be enough to simply go in there and mark X on the ballot box. That many Australian citizens between now and October have to roll our sleeves up. We don't have to be in there spending hours a week, but we do have to try and take a piece of strategic activism under our wing in the months to come. So I think we're nearly at the end of the slide deck. Thanks, Maria. This is obviously our call to action. We want as many of you as possible to say, yep, I'm going to become a conversation host. I'm going to do my bit this way. Doesn't preclude you from engaging in the referendum in any other way, but it's a streamlined way of being influential. And we'd love you to talk your mates into becoming hosts as well. So you just have to climb on and register with Together Yes, and our pledge back to you is we'll make it really worthwhile. So I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of people in the next slide. So as I think many of you in your workplaces and NGOs would know, you can't do this sort of thing unless donors step in and support you. And we've had, thankfully, before Christmas, enough generous donors to weigh in and give us the means to start the whole process. We've got a very small staff, and we've got a great wad of about 24 incredible volunteers who have been working their butts off since September, October to get us where we are. We have campaign partners, including the Uniting Church of Australia, and many more partnerships that aren't there yet on our website. We've had wonderful web designers, and we've had the wonderful artwork of Alkina Wilkinson, who's a young Yorta Yorta woman in Echuca. She has designed a beautiful 4-part panel in our office to depict the journey of Koori Women Mean Business with the Women's Trust anyhow. And so Alkina gave us permission to use her artwork in our campaign. So that's it for the slide deck. It's now over to you for questions.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm amazed that that's your first sip of water because that was an incredible presentation, so much depth of thinking and content, and I'm just really grateful that you're able to share it with us. And just to clarify for people what participating today, we will share this recording after today's session, and also a link so you can sign up as a conversation host or share that with others as well. So Mary, you talked a little bit in terms of the agenda of what you might expect to discuss during these conversations, these sort of facilitated conversations. So you did talk about, having a part of the conversation that allowed for a discussion about the true history of our country. What other kinds of things are on those agendas for those meetings?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Well, again, and this has taken a huge amount of time, but in the first session, there will be a group activity at which the table will be cleared, and the conversation host needs to have got some downloaded material from us and cut them up into sort of cards, if you like. And the group of people will then start to assemble. Each person will hold 3 or 4 of these cards, and the conversation host will know which one goes down first. So the first card will go down, it'll have a decade and a potted 2 or 3 sentences. And the group will then put all of the cards in chronological order down on the table. So the group will be able to visualise 180 years or so of persistent, in every state and territory, persistent calls by Indigenous Australians to be recognised, to be respected, to be accorded dignity. They will actually see the chronology for themselves. And I think that's a powerful way of people, and then, there'll be a second deck that shows a more hopeful pathway, a second deck of a dozen or so cards that the group can then interpose on the chronology of where material examples of where Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians have joined forces for a better deal. And so that exercise, I think, enables people who haven't had vast experience in Aboriginal affairs, haven't looked at history a lot, but can see literally before their eyes a rigorous plain speak chronology that goes to a powerfully long time, and the group will be asked, what 2 or 3 conclusions would we draw from that chronology? So someone might say, boy, I had no idea. Someone might say, persistent rejection. Others might say, yes, but there's hope. Look at that. People have actually, 300,000 people walked over Sydney Harbour Bridge. So that's an example, Amy, of the kind of material. It's not a traditional campaign material. It's hard won in terms of historical fact and sorting it and putting it cleanly. I got the idea initially because Megan Davis and George Williams' fantastic book, Everything You Need to Know About Uluru, they actually have early in that book, page after page after page of chronological milestones, but it's a mixture of things. And I wanted to pull out from there the milestones, the Pilbara strikes, the Barunga Statement, the petitions that weren't passed on to the King. I wanted to actually focus on all of the on-the-record ways in which Indigenous Australians have begged and pleaded with the settler institutions for a fairer go. And then that first session will also be followed by a short film, for example, of Jackie Huggins, who reflects on what it was like for her as an 11-year-old kid to see her mother campaigning for the 67 referendum. And then it will end with people listening to the Uluru Statement. So the point is, I know it sounds a bit of a jargon term, but we're really trying to get people to go on a little bit of a journey through session 1 and then do that shoring up work in between, and then go on a bit of a journey in session 2, rather than just looking at a whole lot of campaign material. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds amazing, and it sounds, you know, the obvious purpose of this is to build support for the campaign, but it's really more than that, isn't it? It's helping us as a country to understand who we are, and I really love how it's respectful. It's sort of assuming the goodness in other humans, that if we understand the situation, we are likely to support this modest ask from First Nations people. But the thing that through the session I was thinking is, and it relates to a question that we've been asked, is when you first think about it, you think about sort of sitting around with your friends for a meal or for a cup of tea. But then as you sort of listen to how the model works and the resources that are provided, I can see it working in lots of contexts. For example, you know, a management committee on a community organisation could have this conversation together, or staff within an organisation could facilitate a conversation during lunchtime. You might ask your local school or a school you're involved in if, you know, there might be an opportunity to talk to parents. So it looks to me like it's something that could be picked up, and it's really the limit of your imagination in terms of the networks you can. So
Amy, you've put it beautifully.
Yeah. And have you seen it being used in that way?
Not yet, because the materials aren't finished.
Yes. I guess the model, have you seen the model kind of used?
Oh, absolutely. And look, you know, I'll just give you a quick example from, you know, got nothing to do with the serious nature of a referendum about this, but years ago, there's a small group of men and women in Melbourne who constituted themselves as the AFL fan organisation, and they got in touch with me. It's a long story, and I mentored them into having a kitchen table conversation with 110 football fans who came into the Morris Rioli room at the Richmond Football Club one Sunday, and they had a 2.5-hour discussion. So there were 10 or 11 tables with 10 football fans. I've never seen so many disparate footy hats and scarves. They were all there. You know, Brisbane Lions, Collingwood, whatever, they were all there. And so they had a facilitated discussion. They were meeting as strangers around questions of what do they most like about football, what do they least like, how could the game be improved, how could it be improved from a fan point of view, and so on. And the discussion, the roof nearly went off because people had so much to say. They loved it so much. And we heard so many people walking out of the room saying, oh, God, I never thought I'd sit next to a Collingwood supporter and have that kind of conversation. And then the fan association, we got all of that input assembled and marshalled. And, of course, what they did as the lobby group is they developed their own platform, the platform that was grounded in the experience and the wisdom of fans themselves. And every time now, when I listen to the Fans Association on the radio picking up on an issue about AFL football with the fans in mind, I just think back to half a dozen years ago when they didn't have a well-articulated base. And now they do, because they went to the sources of wisdom and experience. They went to ordinary folk and they gathered up that experience and wisdom, and they're putting it to good use. So I've seen it work time and time again. And so much so, Amy, that at times I feel a bit of a charlatan in talking about it, because you know what? It's such a simple thing to do. The logistics to pull it off is hard work. But the actual output, the performance of people sitting together in good faith, rubbing shoulders with one another respectfully and positively, always leads to great outcomes.
So, Mary, you said, I think you said, if I'm right, that the resources that would help a person host these conversations will be ready toward the end of the month. So for people who are super keen to do this and start organising these types of sessions, the steps that you would, this is what I'm hearing, so I need you to clarify, is that you would sign up to be a host and you'll receive the relevant information and resources. But in terms of organising the conversations, the first one, the resources would be ready for you to start hosting those conversations sort of at the end of the month.
Yeah, to be on the safe side, people could start signing up and they could start chatting, phone, email, whatever, over the next couple of weeks, say, hey, I'm going to do this, blah, blah, blah. You could certainly reliably be downloading the materials at the end of May. So you could be getting your group together. And even though we're under pressure about, making sure that the materials are, as best as they can be and then formatted, and we've got to make sure, for example, with the Shabbat table talks, those Friday night discussions, they can't occur with any IT laptops or anything on the table as part of the cultural expectation. So we have to make sure, for example, that the film, the Jackie film, which they won't be able to show at the time, but we'll have to make sure that the transcript of that film is available to them so they can maybe get people around the table reading out parts of Jackie's statement. So we've got a fair bit of finessing to do in the next 2.5 weeks, but we will get there. So I would say that people, if they're interested, they could start rallying their mates for a conversation group late May and certainly in June, July, August.
Great. And so, Mary, another question I think that's come through is about people, I guess, on the left who have a sort of a history of being an ally in terms of Indigenous activism, but in relation to this particular issue, they are falling into the soft or hard no category. And I guess we might make the assumption that those people have actually a level of literacy and understanding about the issues. Do you think this this technique or these conversations would be helpful to hold conversations with those people?
Definitely. I think it goes, though, to the question of, and we've been asked at every session, how some guidance about how do you, which people you ask in to your group. And our answer has always been that it must be at your comfort level. So if you feel comfortable having 4 or 5 people who are your mates and maybe 3 or 4 people who are their mates, but you haven't met them, then that's fine. If you're comfortable in getting people together who might be just your family members, that's fine. If you're more comfortable if you are comfortable in setting up, for example, a discussion, as you said, Amy, at work or whatever, where people might be a bit resistant, then fine. The main thing is to do it with good faith and with respect. And if people aren't interested, don't hold it against them. You just work with what you've got and you work in good faith the whole time. And it's not about engaging in argument. It's actually about inviting people in for an experience in which there is conversation and good materials on the assumption that they may well be positively affected by that experience. But this is not about taking people to task for voting no or being soft yes. I think what happened in 6 months of last year after the referendum pledge was announced and before the Yes campaign could get off the ground is that the public space was occupied largely by people who saw fit to disparage either the Uluru Convention or to start deliberately obfuscating the issue and to cause confusion. And so the no case actually stole a march. but I think that's being wound back.
Thank you, Mary. I think that's.
But I'm sorry, Amy. One more point there. Sorry. I think. I mean, right from the beginning, it was assumed by us at the Women's Trust that we were bringing our model into the service of the campaign, and that we wished to do so with all the respect for an Indigenous-led campaign, which is what we're doing with the Yes Alliance. But having said that, I would remind people that the overwhelming majority of voters in October, or where it is, are not Indigenous people. So I think there's a case that non-Indigenous people, and let's face it, we're the ones historically who have dealt the bad hand to Indigenous people. We have to do the work. So I'm very conscious of the fact that non-Indigenous people shouldn't slide into the thinking that Indigenous leadership has to do all this hard work, when in fact the problem is not of their making. Yeah. So most people who vote in October will be non-Indigenous, and that's the reality. And we have to use that to its most strategic effect.
So following on from that, someone is asking that within the material, does it tackle directly the no arguments?
Good question. And no, not directly, but we will use over between now and October, we will be making sure that the no arguments are tackled on our website, for example. So they'll be, the no argument critique will be complementary material. If it will be supplement. But we don't want people to get down in the reeds in these two meetings, trying to work their way through what a lot has been confusing. So, but we will tackle it, but not in the sessions themselves. But the assumption is that in the sessions themselves, people actually start to get very, very clear on some fundamental concepts. And when you're clear on those fundamental concepts, it's actually quite easy to start dealing with the no case. So, for instance, the representation that was put by a former Prime Minister to the Senate committee the other week, that, why should 4% of the population have a say over everybody else? Well, I think when people work through our materials, when they get a sense of the timescale and the nature of first occupancy and the deal that has been dealt to Indigenous people for the last 200 years, and to the benefits that will flow from a nation that comes to terms better with its troubled past, then it makes it easier to actually see through a lot of the no position. I mean, when you argue that 4% of people, why should they get a special deal? Well, it's not actually about a special deal. It's about reckoning with what has happened. And it's about saying that we have reduced our Indigenous Australians to being the most marginalised and disadvantaged group in our society. And we've done it over generations. So this is about actually finding a way to course correct, which is going to be better for national identity. It's going to be better for Indigenous people in remote and urban settings. I mean, it's no accident that there will be people in Brisbane, Indigenous people in Brisbane, who will not use high quality health services near to them because they are too afraid to. They distrust them because what white society has done over generations is to breach the trust of Indigenous people. Now, trust can be repaired, but it's going to take conscious strategies and conscious effort. So I've got a bit lost in my answer there. I got a bit carried away.
No, I think it was a good answer, and it also, I think people watching or participating are thinking about the reality of hosting a conversation and the things that might come up, because many of us have had these sort of, we haven't had these conversations, but we have had a version of a conversation about this with our friends and family, and there's various reasons why people have diverse views. And Terry is saying in the questions that, you know, her view is that often people are in support of recognition, but troubled by the actual model of representation. So is that sort of technical detail something you can expect to be able to respond to within these?
We'll respond to that in the second session. We'll show, we'll start, you know, with the sort of report card on the extent of disadvantage and marginalisation. Yes, but then we'll show a very, very clear demonstration of how the local, regional and national voice will operate. And we will have a short film in the second session of about half a dozen Australians, 5 or 6 Indigenous Australians, showing down on the ground level how the voice will make a material difference in the delivery of services. And I think so that will carry in the second session on what is the voice and how it make a difference. And I think when people have worked through that, they'll also end up understanding that, you know, for those people who would say, well, we've already put so much money into Indigenous health and welfare, and it's, you know, whatever, I think people come to a conclusion of, well, yes, we have, but it hasn't been squandered down at base. It's actually failed policy and failed programming. That's the issue, because people at Commonwealth and state levels have been delivering, trying to invest in programs and welfare and so on, without consulting, without understanding or coming close to understanding the lived experience and the realities of Indigenous people in remote communities or in urban Brisbane or whatever. And we've got to contend with the fact that, you know, it's not easy in this country of ours to actually discuss issues of race. You know, it's hard and we've shied away from it a lot, but I've just been gently reminding people that we had a White Australia policy in place for 7 decades. And although you can dismantle a policy at the Commonwealth level 40 years ago, the cultural underpinnings of that policy don't just disappear. They actually hang around, which is why I think my reference earlier to younger generations who have got, for the most part, a better and stronger and more insightful recognition of past First Nations people and the settler narrative, that we need to be clearing the deck a bit so that they can get on with that good work in the decades to come. You know, I think there is an older cohort of men and women in this country who have never moved outside the settler narrative and who do have some very entrenched, very, very entrenched and hardline views on the status and the place of Indigenous Australians. And this modest proposal is not the be all and end all, but it will start, I think, to shift the narrative and make it easier for people coming behind us to build a better foundation in terms of relationship between Indigenous Australia and non-Indigenous.
Mary Helen, I think it is talking about some amazing activities that she's already undertaken in support of the Yes campaign, which I think she's describing as more traditional activities to support a campaign. So handing out flyers, helping to organise events with experts speaking, those types of activities, and potentially feeling that actually being the one to facilitate the conversation and host the conversation is maybe an intimidating activity to participate in. Could you speak a little bit to how, because I know that you touched on this during your presentation, but how much of an expert you need to be in order to sign up.
Not at all. Not an expert. Just a person of good faith, a person who can warmly welcome people around the table, put the jug on, put the Tim Tams out, take the materials from our website, do the copying of the key pages that need to be done, and basically making sure that the agenda for the meeting, which we set out with sort of suggested time periods for each key concept, making sure that the group works its way through and doesn't get to the end and saying, oh my God, we haven't done any of this because we got too carried away and too excited. So the conversation host, for example, starts the meeting by saying, well, look, Together Yes have given us half a dozen ground rules for the next couple of hours. They are these. And everybody reads them. And so the host says, are we happy to accept those as our ground rules? And everybody says, oh yeah, God, yes. And away you go. So my point would be for people, when I talked before about how do we learn and how much we learn from one another, I'd also ask people to do a bit of a check on how good they are at organising stuff with people. I mean, everybody basically, unless you live on an island as a total recluse, you're pretty good at saying, hey, how about the five of us go and see a film? How about we go to the footy? How about we go to the rugby? How about we go out for a meal? How about we have a picnic on a spring day? We're pretty good at picking up the phone and saying, hey, I'm going to do this. Why not? And it's not much different. It's not much different. And if you're not working with strangers. So you're not having to text a stranger and say, I'd like to have a meeting to discuss the referendum at my house on such and such. And they say, get lost. You're not doing that. You're actually working. And even if your whole group were yes voters right now, my point is, imagine how much more conversant and influential you would be come August to then start to actually have a conversation with people that you might know very well. So my advice would be, and look, I think going to that question, and back to the insolidarity and the complementarity, the fact that there are people like Helen doing so much good stuff already, if she doesn't want to actually become a conversation host, we're not going to say, oh, tut tut. We're going to say strength to her arm. But what we are saying is if you want to actually go something even a bit further than that, then here's an avenue.
And I just want to say to Jane Holden online, I think Mary answered that one really well before, saying absolutely, if you're on a board, this model would be a perfect model to use with your board if your board wanted to think about their support for the Yes campaign.
Yeah.
Because I do know as well that a lot of organisations are talking about, well, how do you actually have a conversation internally about the organisation's position? So
yeah, and I think the I can understand the bit of a fear or an anxiety about starting and conducting a conversation with people you know or don't know very well, but and I'm hoping that the emphasis on our discussion materials helps because you're actually not sitting down and constructing a conversation from nothing. You're actually guiding, helping a conversation to take off because of the material. So that group session, that group activity I outlined about that chronology, to have people see that and hear it, because people will be asked to read out their card and put it down, or if they don't want to read it out, the conversation host can read it out. But just to ask people, what conclusions would you start to draw from that? That's the extent almost of that discussion around that activity. And then you move on. And so the conversation host says, now, according to our agenda, it's now time for us there's a short film with Jackie Huggins, and just watch it and then say, wow, what would you be thinking now of, Jackie talks about that 67 referendum as being totally influential for the rest of her life. Just having a sense, having a response to what people see and hear is actually enough at this point. And then when we ask people to sit and listen to the Uluru Statement being read, the conversation host simply needs to say, look, how about let's shut our eyes. Let's just listen with every bone in our body to the words of this Uluru Statement. Now, when they listen, a minute or so later, they don't have to have a great big discussion about the merits of the Uluru Statement. It's just, again, the conversation host leading a discussion about response and not getting into detail. So it's really about tapping into ways in which people's hearts and minds start to actually come together. And our assumption is that most Australians lurk decent human beings. Most Australians haven't read about the past. Most Australians, most non-Indigenous people haven't had the pleasure, the privilege or the experience of actually knowing an Indigenous person. And in the same-sex marriage debate, the difference is that most families, most extended families, there would be someone in that family who is gay, and they could feel a support and an empathy. But we don't have that situation when the majority of Australians haven't had the direct connection with Indigenous people. Now, I've been so privileged in my work at the Trust that I have been able to sit at the feet of extraordinary women. Marcia Langton, June Oscar, Leanne Miller, to name a few, where I've really been able to learn and adjust and seek new information and seek a new perspective. But that doesn't happen for a lot of Australians. So we've got to find ways in the discussions to be able to appeal to the heart and mind of people so that it actually shifts the dial.
Mary, Yvonne has said she is a proud Kamilaroi person, and she's done some training with the Community Alliance in Brisbane about how to support the Yes campaign, and she's doing her first presentation tonight, which is fantastic, and we wish you absolutely all the best with that, Yvonne. I can also see that Jane Holden is saying, that not only is she thinking about her neighbourhood management committee, but the potential for neighbourhood centres across the state to be holding conversations with their networks and the people they're connected with. And Peter is saying, let's hope that this conversation inspires many of us to have as many kitchen table conversations as possible. These things are making me think about Queensland in particular, and you laid out in your presentation that to get a successful referendum, we need not just a majority of votes across the country, but a majority of states. What's your impression in terms of where Queensland's going and how important it is that Queenslanders mobilise and put any resources that we have behind this campaign?
Well, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? I mean, every state people have to get out and do the work. The 67 referendum was carried with an outstanding 90%, largely because of the civil society mobilisation and the partnerships with Indigenous Australians. I think, it would be pie in the sky. It's a different set of issues, and, society's become more complex and more hardline on some things. But every state should be aiming, Queenslanders included, to keep the yes vote in the 50s and growing. In the 50s and growing, and not in the 50s and declining over the next months. There's a lot of nastiness, a lot of confusion, And I think people have to just remain really level-headed, people working in their communities wherever they can. I mean, when we went to Cairns, for example, a couple of weeks ago, the people at the end of our session, one of the things they decided to do was to form a network of conversation hosts across Cairns to help one another and to grow the movement there. And that's been one of the thrilling things at going around to all the states so far. And I know this, I've seen this happen time and time again on different issues. As soon as you provide the basis for people to take off and use their agency and work with one another, it just becomes really exciting. And we're seeing the same thing happen with this. But my point is, we can't be complacent. There is work to be done. And I guess my parting message about not getting down in the weeds, what people should do, apart from rolling up their sleeves, but just be really careful about who they're listening to. You know, I mean, I have seen, I had, for example, in a session in New South Wales, a woman, a non-Indigenous woman, say, the Uluru Statement was just a sham. It was plagiarised from Africa. And I thought, wow, where did that come from? And so I'm a bit of a researcher. You know, I'm curious. So I did the research on it. And where it's come from is from a commentator, a writer in the Australian newspaper called Chris Merritt. He's described as a legal affairs contributor. He heads up, or is vice president, of something called the Rule of Law Institute, which one of its last annual reports was labelled The Death of Democracy in Australia. And when you read that annual report, the death of democracy is apparently under dangerous threat in this country because, for example, of the Dan Andrews government's pandemic management legislation. And then I started, I know where these people are coming from. These people aren't rigorous legal eagles. These people are right-wing ideologues, but they're having a ball because they've got platforms in the Australian where they can write about how the voice is going to destroy civilization. The sky's going to fall in. So we've got to be really careful about who we read and just block our ears to a lot of the noise and just focus on the principles. And the principles, pretty much, do we wish to honour and respect the occupancy of this continent before Europeans arrived? Do we want to honour and respect that and write it into the Constitution? Yes or no? And the second principle is European settlement dealt a savage cross-generational blow to the lives and the hopes and the expectations of Indigenous people all around this country. And governments for generations have failed to deliver policies and programs that address the deep disadvantage still experienced. Do we want to find a mechanism in our Constitution that will actually start to make a difference 200 years on? Yes or no? First principles.
Mary, I think most people online, if they feel anything like me, would feel very energised by this conversation and empowered to not just know that you're going to be voting yes and sort of wring your hands hoping everybody else will too, but actually we've got some time. The referendum's not till October. We've got some time. We all know some people. There are going to be resources available to help us have really meaningful conversations with the people that we feel comfortable talking to. And that's, within our own, our own agency could be used to decide who those conversations would be had with, how and where. I want to thank you so very much for doing the work that you're doing, as well as for sharing with us today. I think we're ready to conclude now, but we will be sharing this recording with everyone who registered for this event, because we had lots of people register as well as the people attending today. And in addition to that, we will be sending out information to everyone who registered about how to sign up to have a kitchen table conversation. As I said at the beginning of this session, QCOSS is supporting the Yes campaign, and we will be looking from now till the referendum at ways to use our platform and our networks to put support behind the Yes campaign. So for those joining us today, please stay engaged with this, share what you've learned with us, and please continue to engage with this just incredibly important moment in our history. Mary, can I just say thank you so much?
And Amy, could I just add one final comment? Thank you for the opportunity, but I also want to acknowledge one of your staff, Elspeth Muir, because this online briefing would not have been possible. Elspeth came to the session in Brisbane, and it's to her credit that she has used her agency to take a step further than just attending that Brisbane meeting. So I just want to acknowledge that that's typical of the kind of energy and the imagination that people can use in the months to come.
Fantastic. That is true. And thank you, Elspeth. And thank you to all the other QCOSS staff that were also involved in this, bringing this session. Thank you again, Mary. We really appreciate it. And thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today. I hope you go forth and hold kitchen table conversations.
Thanks, Amy.
Thanks so much, everyone.